All right, guys. Um, in Leviticus 17 today, the part that actually I started going through Leviticus, and 1 through 16 has really got a lot to do with the specifics of sacrifices and dealing with leprosy, which I think there are certainly some parallels there, particularly with leprosy and the idea of church discipline and stuff like that. You can read the first part of Leviticus and then go and compare it to like Matthew 18 and other passages like that that deal with church discipline, and you can see the similarities there. But the passage that really kind of stood out to me, or the verse that really stood out to me, was Leviticus 17, verse 11. It says, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make an atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that maketh an atonement for the soul." And this goes right along with Hebrews 9, where the writer of Hebrews in verse 22 says that that without the shedding of blood there can be no remission of sin. And there are certainly some parallels there between, or there's some contrast rather, between the word that we get atonement and then the word that we get remission. And the writer of Hebrews talks about this as well, that with Christ's blood, our sins were remitted. They were removed once and for all. But atonement is a covering. It is something that covers for, basically a time. It just covers our previous sins, and then when we sin again, we have to sacrifice again, and so on and so forth. And this was the Old Testament way of doing this. But the part that really stood out to me was the fact that even going back to our oldest records, going back to like Cain and Abel, you had the works of Cain's hand versus the sacrifice that Abel brought forth, showing that sacrifice even predates Moses. This is not just in the Mosaic covenant that we're dealing with sacrifices. It predated that. You could even go back to Adam and Eve and the fact that they had to take the skins of animals to cover, and so on and so forth. But the point being is that God was always telling a story that through the death of one, or that death was necessary to deal with sin, and that through the death of his son, sin will be dealt with. But this also kind of flies in the face of the idea of universalism, the idea that all religions are the same, that everybody is on the same path to get to God, and so on and so forth. Specifically because you go back to the Old Testament and it's talking about death is necessary. Nowhere in there does it say, when you start getting into things like the commandments and stuff like that, these are all ways in which they were to govern themselves and live. But nowhere in there does it say, by keeping the commandments, and now all of a sudden you're made right with God and your sins are atoned for. I mean, nowhere in the Old Testament does it say that. Nor does it say it in the New Testament. The point being is that Old Testament and New Testament, it was always the shedding of blood. It was always through the death and sacrifice that our relationship was made right with God. In Galatians, it talks about how sin had to be defined. So the law defines what sin is. If you don't have a definition, you can't really have something. So the law defines what sin is, and this is in contrast to a lot of these world religions that are on basically kind of a merit system. They're on a system where we're made right with God through the works of our own efforts, which is what Cain dealt with, and why God rejected his offering. But every other world religion, whether it be Islam or Buddhism, Buddhism, they don't really believe in a God, but they do believe in like a force, so to speak. But all of these different religions, they're all based on reaching this elevated state, whether it be some state of enlightenment or whatever, they're based on reaching this state of peace, so to speak, through their own efforts. Another way to say it would, be, you can boil down every single world religion down into the do and the done. There are those who believe that you have to do these things in order to be made right with God, and then there are those who believe that it's already done. But the point being is that it was always told from our oldest records that death would be necessary, that God would provide His own sacrifice. And then we get over to the New Testament and we see that God did provide His own sacrifice. He provided His Son, and that through His Son's death we're made right. So that was something that kind of stood out to me, and I wanted to go ahead and share that with you guys today. All right, God bless.